Hi YouTubers. I'm just out of the car park at the moment of something different today. Going to a creationist meeting of all things, and going to see how we get on. Really, sorry, it's in as you see, I'm on night shot at the moment. Yeah, a little bit nervous. It's not the sort of thing I normally go to. Thought it'd be interesting to see what goes on, and speak to you soon. Hopefully I can take some pictures inside, so we'll see what's happening. Peace, see you soon.
Next time you present that. And if you're first time here and want to keep in contact, there is next to a little donations box some slips which you can put your name and your address or email, and we'll be able to keep in touch that way and advertise when our meetings are.
Through millions of years of evolutionary history, if you can actualize a plan at a discrete moment in time. That's exactly what appears to have occurred in the Cambrian explosion.
If numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection.
The forms of life have gradually evolved from one simple organism. In fact, the evidence flatly contradicts the evolution of species, something that Darwin himself was aware of when he published his Origins in 1859. He lived in hope of finding transitional fossils to prove his case. The film states that there must have been an intelligent source of life, but it doesn't say what or who was that source might be. Hence, the intelligent design movement includes people of various persuasions. Some of them would say God did it, others might attribute it to Allah, others might be sympathetic to the idea that there were some alien species that had a fly past and dropped some seeds of life on Earth as they went by millions of years ago. But the point is this, that here is a direct contradiction to atheistic evolutionary explanations. There must have been a creator. Life is far too complex and it requires more than just DNA and energy. Information is absolutely necessary, and it can only come from an intelligent source. Also, the film doesn't tie in with the biblical account of creation, nor does it mention at all the God of creation. As a purely materialistic inquiry, it didn't attempt to address the questions of who are we, what is our relationship to God, what are our spiritual needs, what is the Creator's intention for us, or his demands upon us, or how has he provided for our eternal well-being. So, just very briefly, let me add what the film left out. And what we want to know, what we want you to know if you've never been to a meeting like this before. Simply this, the Bible tells us that we were created by God. The scientific evidence supports this, surprising as it might seem, despite what we're told in the media. It still begs the question, and I think this is what the problem was to Darwin, to Richard Dawkins, is that even assuming that there were some very primitive
Life
cells,
before.
life forms,
That's right.
why is there this sudden jump where there's no transition fossils?
Well, it's not. It's quite sudden, of course, but of course that's the Earth hadn't had any creatures expanding into it prior to that in larger forms.
But where are all the creatures that are supposed to have preceded?
Well, they are there. We have.
Well, they're not. That's the whole point of the film.
The film does have a few flaws, unfortunately.
I mean,
you do have trace fossils, for instance, in the Precambrian. You have trace fossils and the burrows and things like this. We also have fossils like Sprigina, which.
But the point is that they're making is that there was a very limited, so-called millions of years between those simple creatures and the hard-formed skeletal creatures like trilobites. The only explanation that the geologists usually try to come up with, they were there, but they all got worn away.
Well, there's things like Charnia, of course, from Leicestershire. Charnia being those, you saw them in the film, in fact, those long strands that were neither plant nor animal. So there
They're
are.
they're all fully formed creatures.
It was fully formed, yes, in that. But of course, it was large enough then to be seen. But you've got to get a certain time when you're not going to find much at all. You actually did find in that film. It also pointed out some coral embryos, for instance, which go far back beyond the Cambrian.
It's helpful to children. Just hang on a minute. Through the chairman, please. Otherwise we end up with lots of discussions. Children had their hands up first, but then a question now.
I was just going to ask a question. Spagula, I mean, half the stuff you're coming out with, I didn't understand at all. I must admit that. But the question was that for anything you dig out of the ground that's dead or fossilised or whatever, you cannot prove that it had a child. You can't prove it actually, produced anything else. All you can say is that's what that was. So you can't get another fossil and say that creature became that creature. It's totally and utterly impossible. It's total speculation. It's got to be.
Well,
it's totally illogical to suggest that two things you dug out of the ground, one has become another, even if it looks is just a different size or anything. You just cannot say that in any logical sense that it's become that. I mean, if anyone was there at the time, they could say, "Oh yes, I know the grandfather of that one, and I know the relationships and all the family." I mean, today a naturalist would look out on meerkats or whatever and study them and watch them from a distance and see what's going on in the social groupings. But there's no way that from digging up a fossil you can work out what child, came from this trilobite, and what child, how, it's ridiculous.
It's probably not the exact child. You probably could be looking at one fossil then to another and thousands of generations between.
Yeah, but that's
you can't
the
show
whole
that
point of the
generation.
film.
Yes.
There weren't the thousands of generations before the trilobites. They suddenly appeared, and that's the dilemma.
But then they've also found different fossils in China. They found them in Wales. We have them in, of course, the Burgess Shale and various other areas. But they say they've got a full record of them, but of course they haven't, because there are differences between, and they even admitted there are differences between the ones in China and the ones in the Burgess Shale, for instance. There are slight differences. They're not exactly the same. Now, when two people get together and they have offspring, you never get half male, half female, do you? You'll always get an individual difference in your offspring. There'll always be something slightly
but
different.
They always have a plan, just like the car illustration,
Cars, of course, you're not driving around in the first car, like we're not flying around in the Wright Brothers Kitty Hawk, are we? There is an evolution of it.
Yeah.
But obviously it's a different sort of evolution when you take into account things like cars and mechanical objects, because you can go back to the drawing board and you can design a new car.
Even the first one had to be designed, and that's the point maybe the first trilobite had to be designed rather than evolved.
Well, it's an arthropod, of course, and the arthropods, the trilobite was 300 million years it was around for. It died out in the end of the Permian period.
But the first one, where did the first one come from?
Right. It has eyes that resemble other arthropods.
Compound eyes, which were
Compound eyes. In the case of trilobites, they were calcite, and that's why they fossilised so well. But it was only the trilobite had that type of eye. We do know of another 50-odd arthropods from the same period that also had compound eyes. Obviously, the modern insects of today have come from those early arthropods. But they didn't come from trilobites. The trilobites.
But it doesn't. What I'm saying.
There was an original one right back at the beginning, there, wasn't there?
Original, yeah.
There has to be an original one. So the thing is, do you think everything has happened in the last all this evolution that I call evolution has happened in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years? It's far too short a time for it to happen. And yet everything follows a pattern. The phyla, that we saw the phyla on the film. They follow the phyla. Everything follows that phyla. You never expect a duck to suddenly become a crocoduck, as you've probably heard about. That's impossible. That would never happen. It has to follow its phyla, its line. And this is what we find. It's
Well, we
exactly
don't-
what we
No,
find.
you haven't found it.
The whole
You
point
can't.
is, whole point is we don't find a common ancestor, which is what Dawkins says. You go back to the common ancestor, but there isn't one. We don't find.
You're not going to find the first one because it's
Well, there
not
ought
going to be
be.
fossilised, is
There
it?
ought to be, and this is what Darwin's
There
case
ought
was.
to be.
There ought to be thousands, millions of
First
additional
ones.
fossils in
There are. There are. Yes, there are. Yes, they have. And the problem is, every time one pops up, you say, well, where's the gap between that one and that one? It used to be, how do whales evolve? Now, this is a well-known one that I think you all know. But, of course, in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a massive find of, mainly because they looked in Pakistan area, and that's clearly the area they actually did the evolving. So once you know where to find them, you start to find a lot more. And they have found transitional fossils of the whale.
well,
And horses.
varieties of whale form, but they're still like the car plan, one plan.
Well, they might be on a car plan, that's fine.
So the
But then
whale
that's what
plan-
you'd expect to find, surely.
Right,
That's if you
let's
believe that.
We have another question.
It's not so much belief, it's more of the evidence.
There's no evidence. One creature can't prove it came.
Another question.
How do you know that trilobites? How do you know that trilobites are actually extinct?
Well,
For sure.
we don't know. I mean, that's the thing. There's been creatures that like the
You know.
coelacanth, which was believed to be dead for millions of years, and suddenly appeared in the 1930s and fished them up, and they've been finding them since.
That's right.
Very deep sea fish. So I suppose there could be something around, but we don't know. I suppose that you've got little creatures now like woodlice and things which are sort of similar to.
They're not,
Yeah,
not
we
trilobites,
know more
though.
about space and the moon than we do the bottom of the ocean.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you never know.
Oh yes,
what might be
there's
at the
goodness
bottom.
knows what's down
You
there.
never
Yeah.
know.
We've discovered a fraction.
Yeah.
Do they live at the bottom of the ocean?
We don't know.
They lived at lots of different areas. Some of them
Some of
lived,
them swam,
some of them swam, some of them lived in
bottom.
basically in the mud at the bottom, some of them in complete darkness and were blind.
So some could be at the bottom of the ocean even today.
Well, theoretically, it's always possible, but there's been no evidence of them for 250 million years ago. They actually became extinct at the end of the Permian period, which actually wiped out 90% of life on Earth at that time.
Mm.